Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to ODI and welcome to all our guests online to this exciting event about the politics of growth. My name is Marta Foresti. I work here at ODI on a number of issues, most lately on issues related to migration and development, but I'm one of the historic members of the Politics and Governance program at ODI that with Tim, Dirk and others has worked over the years on the issues of politics and growth. My task is only to welcome you and say hello, and I just want to share one thought with you. I was thinking this morning about this relationship between politics and growth, and thinking that it seems to me that we've gone a long way. We travelled quite some journey from the days when we all politely agreed that the two things were intimately related, and that together they affected development outcomes. And I'd like to think that today we are in a position where beyond that polite acknowledgement, and economists and political scientists sort of being cautious to one another and recognize each other's values are increasingly working together to do things in different ways and to affect the way we work, we think, and we talk about the practice of development in ways that is informed by both politics and economic thinking. And I was thinking that one of the reasons why I am struck by the journeys we travel is that I compared it with other famous dichotomies of relationships that we live with in development that I think have not quite gone beyond that initial stage of cautious and polite recognition of the fact that two things are related. Think of humanitarian action and development, or think of something that is very present in my mind at the moment. Everybody seems to recognize that development and migration go together, but very few have good ideas about what to do about it in practice. Well, on this one, I think we've made some progress, and we're going to hear a lot about it today. And other reasons why I'm optimistic, and I think there is something in this relationship that is moving forward, is because really influential books are being written on this topic, and we have on the panel today two authors going to talk about that. And I also like to think that here at ODI, at ESID in Manchester, at DFID, at Harvard, and other places, we've all played a role in trying to make some progress on this agenda. And to do that, I cannot think of a better person to help us navigate this relationship, its history, and where we got to today than my colleague Tim Kelsall, who is a senior research fellow here at ODI, previous editor of African Affairs, but also, importantly, the author of one of the landmark books a few years ago on this very topic, Business, Politics and the State in Africa, Challenging the Orthodoxy of Growth and Transformation, which I think plays as an ideal contributing chair to help guide the discussion today. So without further ado, Tim, over to you, and welcome everyone. I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. You're too kind. So how to kickstart economic growth, how to sustain it, and how to transform the economy in a way that creates good jobs and allows entire societies to escape poverty. I mean, these are pressing concerns for development policymakers. Are some political systems better at fostering growth than others? Should developing countries copy the institutions of the West? Is equitable growth possible? And what can reformers do to encourage transformation? These are just some of the questions that are pertinent here. And today I'm pleased to welcome four panelists whose recent work offers important insights into these matters. Yuanyuan Ang of the University of Michigan, whose book How China Escaped the Poverty Trap has been receiving rave reviews and is set to become the latest development blockbuster. Rachel Glenister, formerly of JPAL MIT and now chief economist at DFID, who's going to be talking in a private capacity about how voice and accountability relate to economic growth. Dirk Willem te Velde of ODI, who last year co-authored a major approach paper on supporting economic transformation. And Kunal Sen, whose edited book Deals and Development, in which, full disclosure, I have a chapter on Cambodia, provides an intrepid framework for dissecting the political and economic deals that underpin or undermine transformative growth. I'd also like to welcome you, our audience here in London, and all of those who are watching overseas, and remind you that you can follow the event using ODI's Twitter handle @ODIDev and the event #PoliticsOfGrowth. And for those of you who are watching online, do please send us in your questions and we will try to put some of those to our panellists later when we open the discussion to the floor. And also just to remind you that there will be a lunch provided here at ODI at 1:30. So, Kunal, starting with you, one of the surprising things that your book identifies is the fact that most poor countries that are poor today are not poor because they never grow, but because they cannot sustain that growth.
Yeah, I mean, the conventional view on growth is that growth is to do with long-run processes which happen over lots of years, several decades. And so if you see different living standards across countries, and we see that quite a bit across many countries in the developing world, it's just because of growth rates being different. That's the way we see it in economics. And it's partly linked to the way we think about growth as being steady state growth. But that's not what growth actually is if you look at the data. What you tend to see are developing countries growing very fast, often much faster than richer countries for quite long periods of time, but shrinking rapidly and much more often than rich countries. So if you think about growth in that way, slow growth is not about slow growing, but because of rapid and more frequent shrinking.
So it's this boom and bust pattern that really
exactly.
kind of
So
creates
once you think
the problem for
about
developing
growth
countries.
in that way, you've got to think about why do we see these booms and bust growth rates, and what is it that actually allows booms to happen, and why do we often see busts in growth?
And the argument of the book is that essentially at the root of this boom and bust pattern of growth is politics. And you have a model in which there are kind of three crucial elements: the political settlements, the rent space, and the deal space, which you use to explain how it is that some countries are able to actually escape this boom and bust pattern and sustain growth and escape poverty. So I'd like to kind of take you through those concepts one by one, if I may. So first of all, the political settlement. What is the political settlement? What do you mean by that?
The political settlement in a very short form is the way the balance of power is between ruling elites in a particular country. Are elites cohesive? Are they fragmented? Who has got the power? Who is being excluded from power? And this political settlement we tend to see varies a lot across the countries we studied and changes over time.
And then the rent space, what do you mean by that?
The rent space is a shorthand way of capturing the market structure of the economy, but it's more than that. It's about where economic actors are located in the economy in terms of are they in rent-thick sectors, mining, natural resources, are they in cooperative sectors, garments, footwear, leather, and so on. So it's a way to capture not just the economic structure, but where the rents lie in a particular economy.
And you have some quite specific terms for describing these different sections of the rent space: power brokers, magicians, workhorses, and rent seekers, rentiers. Can you say a little bit more about those terms and what they mean?
So let's start with rentiers. The rentiers are essentially capitalists in the natural resource sectors, which tend to be the rent-thick sectors, and also the exporting sectors. Mining is an obvious example here. And along with that, we also have capitalists or economic actors in non-tradable sectors like utilities, construction, and so on, where also we have a lot of rent. We call them power brokers. And then the other two set of economic actors are magicians, who are essentially in labor-intensive manufacturing and exporting industries, where there isn't that much rent. There's a more competitive sector because you're facing world prices, along with the workhorses, which tend to be the informal sector, again in the non-tradable part of the economy. But the point that we're making is that these economic actors have different arcs of the state. Rentiers and power brokers don't want states to discipline them, don't want states to regulate them. They actually want weak state capacity. But magicians and workhorses need regulation, need industrial policy, particularly for magicians, and so they want effective and a well-functioning state. So in that sense, it does affect the way state capacity evolves over time.
And this affects what you refer to as the deal space, which is the third big concept in your model. So can you say a little bit about the deal space?
We have a fairly simple hypothesis or set of hypotheses. One core hypothesis is that, so how does growth get started? I mean, that's like the first big question. And our hypothesis is that when we have a movement in the deal space from what we call disordered deals, which are deals where essentially elites are offering this to economic actors, but they're not being honored, to ordered deals, that's when growth gets started. But then growth...
And an ordered deal, can you say a little bit more about, what do you mean by an ordered deal?
So ordered deals are a situation where elites are offering these deals to economic actors, but economic actors are fairly reassured that these deals will be actually honored. Okay. So it's essentially fulfill the credible commitment problem.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter at this stage whether markets are open or competitive in your view?
What we have seen in our case studies, and so we have 10 case studies from different parts of Africa and Asia, that the first movement that happens in growth is a movement from disordered deals to ordered deals, from unstable political settlements, often from chaos and conflict. Think about Uganda and Museveni, think about Rwanda and RPF, think about Hun Sen in Cambodia. And that's so essentially a shift from unstable to stable political settlements, often under authoritarian regimes, which then leads to a movement from disordered to ordered deals, which kickstarts growth. That's been pretty much the case that the common element of all growth acceleration we've found across most of our countries.
So that kickstarts growth. And then in some countries, as I understand it, there are feedback loops which are positive and which kind of encourage the growth to be sustained. And then there are others which are, in other cases, those feedback loops are negative and cause growth to collapse. Can you say just a little bit more about that?
So one property of growth accelerations that we found, and I think it probably applies to a lot of other countries also, not just in our 10 case studies, the deals that are often ordered are closed ordered deals, which in other words, it means that they're offered to only a few economic actors. In part because those are the economic actors the political elites know very well. In part because there aren't too many economic actors in a country as it comes out of chaos and conflict. So those are often closed ordered deals. But the problem also is that often the deals are offered to rentiers and power brokers, in other words, in the rent-tech sectors, partly because of mechanisms of rent extraction, partly because those are often the kind of economies that sectors can grow quite quickly. And so essentially the two kinds of feedback loops that happen there. One is the economic feedback loop, which is that when you have rentiers and power brokers becoming more dominant, they essentially want weak state capacity. They are not interested in having a more progressive incremental change in state capacity that is for the better. They really have no interest in that. So that's one feedback loop. But the other feedback loop that we've seen, particularly in countries where there are very strong civil society and third-party institutions like Supreme Courts and so on, is often closed-order deals are seen as cronyistic and crony capitalists, and there's a pushback against those deals. And when there's a pushback against those deals, that feedback loop often leads to a situation the deals again become disordered, leading to a growth collapse.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Yuan, I'm going to bring you in now because this idea of growth being affected by feedback loops suggests that growth is kind of a non-linear and an iterative process. And I think this is also a theme of your book.
Yeah, and so I'm especially delighted to be on this panel because it definitely overlaps with Kunai's theme about these mutual interaction between governance and economic growth. And I think in general in development, we have been very stuck in a linear frame of thinking for quite some time. We've either debated that it's growth that leads to good governance, or it's good governance that leads to growth. And we've really invested a lot of resources and thinking into defending either side of the camp. And if you really sort of step back and think about this debate, at least to me when I started writing this book, I thought that's a very artificial debate, no? Because it's sort of quite obvious that development is what I call a co-evolutionary process. It has to be that politics affects economics affects politics, as Kunai has very nicely summarized. But I don't just want to use the term co-evolution as a metaphor, because instead I want to go one step further and ask, if it is the case that development is a sequence of feedback loops, then what is the first step of this whole sequence, right? That's really the crux of the question. So how do you escape the poverty trap? And when I say poverty trap, I'm saying that poverty reinforces weak institutions reinforce poverty. So what is the first step that takes us out of this sort of feedback loops and launches development? And so the answer that I arrive through my research, mostly in the case of China, but with a few sort of test cases in other parts of the world, surprised me. I literally arrived at the conclusion when I wrote the last page and went back to the introduction and rewrote the introduction. And the answer is that the first step to development is to harness weak institutions to build markets. And that's paradoxical because we've always thought that if you have things like corruption, patronage, lack of intellectual property rights, and so forth, we think of those as the impediments to development. So we need to get rid of them, replace them with best practices, then we could have growth. But we know that in practice it's very hard to get rid of these weak institutions. And so what I find, at least amply demonstrated in the case of China, is that instead of trying in vain to get rid of weak institutions that look weak by first world standards, they simply took these weak institutions and then repurposed them, mixed them up, add them up, recombine them, repurpose them, and use them to actually kickstart development. So one concrete example might be, should I give a concrete example?
Let's come back to that because we're going to talk more about the case of China in a few minutes. But Dirk, I'd like to bring you in quickly here. I mean, does this sort of approach, this thinking about development, does this resonate with SET's approach in ODI to promoting structural transformation?
I suppose let me first say that this approach I think is very nice. So Kunal's book, you've got to be congratulated on a wonderful book. I think you and the editors are magicians, as it were, and of course also congratulations to the workhorses who are doing the domestic case studies underlying this. I think you've got a point there about the importance of downturns in growth and making sure that that's being addressed. So poor countries aren't poor because they haven't grown. They are poor because they've had many more downturns than middle income and high income countries. And then you can people have thought about what can you then do about it. So you think about the resilience of economies and you can have economic, social, and governance reasons for the resilience. And I think you firmly look at the politics of it, so the governance explanation of making countries more resilient to shocks and the like. And I would sort of argue that from a set perspective, well, we would argue that in order to sustain growth, you need to transform your economy. So it's not just about holding pattern growth. The same structures happen, but you need to transform your economy into a more productive economy that is more resilient to shocks, and therefore that becomes really important. And if you think about that, about growth and different type of growth, you can think about sort of the ingredients of growth. You think about the recipe of growth, and so the ingredients of investment, of openness, and so on. The Commission for Growth identified some of those. The recipe, that's when in your final chapter that you look at. Very interesting thinking about, do we now know how to bring these ingredients together? I think there's two more elements that I would bring in as well. One is thinking around the cooks of the sort of the meal that need to bring these ingredients together, following a recipe. So you need to have good cooks, you need to have good leaders who can set visions. That is also very important for economic transformation. So those countries that have transformed have done so with a sort of a credible leadership that has been able to articulate a vision of the future and has persuaded the others in the country that this is a good thing that they should buy into. And the other thing I think I would argue, the fourth thing, is that you need to have a sort of a menu of options as well. So you could put all your eggs in one basket and say, we've only got one sort of meal on the menu. You've got the ingredients, the recipe, you've got a very fantastic cook. We know the recipe and we've got the ingredients, and you can put a fantastic steak on the table. But what if the consumer wants fish, doesn't want steak? You actually supply something in your economy that isn't right. You need to have something else. You need to have something that is in demand. And that's really important, and I think your chapter, Tim, as chair, I think you highlighted that issue in Cambodia, for example, that the interaction with the international economy is really important. And it's not just about governance, it's really important. Political economy is absolutely crucial, but you also need to go into the right area. So you need to think about technically right areas, the economically sound issues where you need to go into. And I think there are a range of techniques that that the SET program is also looking at, which are sort of the housing product space, the productivity analysis, multiplier analysis, and so on, where you can sort of identify which sectors have the biggest bang for the buck, which help you to transform your economy, and which one help you to link into where there is a great demand from the outside world. So linking governance capabilities with where there's demand is really important, so that you've got a menu of options that you can both sell steak, but also a fish meal.
So the external environment is very important as well. Okay, I want to go back a little bit to you talk about the importance of the top leadership and the vision that they may have for development. Rachel, I wonder if you have any reflections on that. I mean, sticking with the culinary metaphor, is it the chef that matters, or is it the sous chefs who are doing all the kind of actual chopping and dicing?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I come at this from the perspective of, so first of all, that, you know, there's no one thing that we can say, oh, do this and, you know, have a great leader and it'll be fine. What you're looking, if you're the kind of person like me who's most of the time working on the ground, working with governments to try and, you know, improve economic prospects and governance and institutions on the ground, you know, I like what Wen was saying about you got to work with the institutions you have, right? You know, it's nice to have this big debate about do institutions matter, but when you're actually trying to provide advice to people, you have to work with the institutions you have. You know, and to some extent the leaders that you have, right? So in some sense, I'm less interested in, you know, is it the leader or because when I'm doing my work, you know, it is whatever the leader is, you know. So I think there's some different approaches that people have taken over time to say, okay, institutions matter, but what do we actually do to improve them, given where we are? And one of the approaches that is probably the one that has the biggest amount of money behind it in the aid industry is community-driven development. So, you know, trying to give money to communities locally and try and change informal institutions on the ground through the mechanism of giving them money and saying, oh, if we give you money, you also have to, you know, make women, you know, listen to women or include the voice of youth. And then we will change these informal institutions by kind of learning by doing, right? And so that was the first thing we looked at. And that actually proved quite effective in improving economic outcomes. So we've just gone back to communities, you know, 7 years later in Sierra Leone and found that the ones that got this money are still economically better off. So you've had long-term impacts on their economies, but the institutions haven't changed at all, and they never changed. You know, you give people money, you tell them to listen to women, and they listen to women while you're giving them money, but as soon as, you know, anything outside that, they don't listen to them. So the institutions haven't changed, but economically it was quite powerful. So we kind of got depressed about that. And then, you know, and then there was this big move to, again, work kind of more on the informal institutions through, there was a big push around the WDR in 2004, you know, put women on the local health committee, or, you know, everything should include, you know, have more local voice. And again, coming from outside, you know, and Lant was a big author of that report, and so we all went around testing that and seeing if it was effective. Pretty mixed, not very encouraging evidence of that. But the things that people have tried, that seems to be more promising, is strengthening the formal institutions of democracy. So, and that's now happening in a number of places, and you know, we saw that and thought, well, let's try in Sierra Leone.
Great. Well, we're going to come back and talk a bit more about that later. But I want to go back to you, Yuan, now, and talk in a bit more detail about China, because it's had this, you know, extraordinary growth. And I saw in the news very recently that China's now committed to eradicating poverty by 2020. And I think what a lot of people probably don't understand, but which well, maybe we forget, but it comes up very clearly in your book, is just how poor China was in 1980.
Yeah, some facts are sort of worth iterating because we hear so much about China's rise that we forget that it's in fact a very poor country. But say in 1980, income per capita in China is actually lower than Bangladesh, Chad, and Malawi. But to be sure, because it was a communist system, certain public services were much higher than in other countries. So literacy rates were higher than in India, for example, and they had barefoot doctors. But the income per capita was low, and I think consumption is another good metric. The nutrition level and the calorie consumption in the 1970s was not higher than in the 1930s, when China was in the midst of civil war. So, in the 40-year gap, there was basically no improvement in consumption and economic growth. So it was a very poor country in 1980. And so when we think about the amount of transformation that they've made in just a matter of a single generation, it's pretty amazing. Another sort of relevant fact is that there's often heard sort of achievement that China lifted 700 million people out of poverty. They actually did that by not having anti-poverty policies. Anti-poverty policies that we hear about, which you just mentioned, is actually a very new thing in China. It sort of started when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. So the 700 million people that were lifted out of poverty was done through market liberalization and national development, but not poverty programs.
Okay, well, I mean, that's very interesting. It's also quite challenging to some of us at ODI, and I think it's quite challenging for international agendas like the SDGs. So maybe you can talk us through in a little more detail now how China kickstarted growth and got to this situation where it's now able to talk realistically about eradicating poverty.
So how it kickstarted growth was it started with politics, as Kunal has reminded us. But when I say politics, I don't mean democratization, because as we know, when the reformist leadership took over, they made a firm decision that they were going to keep the CCP solely in power. There was not going to be any democratization in China. But nevertheless, they actually changed how the bureaucracy operated internally. And so that's a part that we don't see, and therefore many people don't understand. And just to sort of give a catchphrase to describe what they did, I call it directed improvisation. How this works basically is actually kind of a generic idea of adaptive development, that you need to have improvisation from bottom-up actors, obviously, but you also need to have a director, a top-down player, who sets the rules and the parameters for improvisation. And within China, they applied this principle to within the party state. And just to put things in context, when I say the party state, the bureaucracy, we're talking about an organization of 50 million bureaucrats. 50 million is the size of South Korea's population. So this is directed improvisation within the bureaucracy, but still at a very large scale. How it works is that the central government changed its role as a leadership. And going back to Dirk's analogy about, what's a good leader, what's a good chef, under Mao, the central leadership was a commander. So Mao tried to command his way to modernization, targets, dictates, and so forth, and he failed completely. When Deng took over, he decided that we're not going to do the command system anymore, but I'm going to do directing. There are a few things. For example, they would have to set up parameters for what local officials can and cannot do when they do adaptive development. They would have to set up very high-powered incentives for those who succeed. And the central government has the authority to scale up adaptations. And so by this combination of this top-down direction and bottom-up improvisation from 50 million bureaucrats all over a very big country, you have a development process that's actually very locally tailored, flexible, nimble, and adaptive development is now a buzzword in global development, and China is surprisingly a very good illustration of that.
And what you say actually is that China has a franchise model of bureaucracy, right? Can you explain a little bit more about that? What are the incentives that get local bureaucrats to try and bring in investment?
Yeah, and so when we think about franchise, like McDonald's, the idea for franchise is basically that you have a top-down hierarchy, but very localized operations. So if you go to McDonald's throughout the world, in Asia, where I come from, they have McDonald's with pineapples, which is great. You know? It's very delicious. And so you can, but it always looks like McDonald's. So there's a certain consistency, right? Shared principles about this organization, but operationally it's very decentralized and very localized. And so it's somewhat similar in the Chinese bureaucracy as well. Because they are the Chinese Communist Party, there's certain things that are very unified and very consistent. And outwardly, it looks like a very powerful communist government. But inward, it is the operations are actually very decentralized. So for every central mandate that comes down from Beijing, the actual implementation of it just varies tremendously throughout the country. And that's what I mean by franchising.
And as I understand it, in the Chinese system, it doesn't really matter how local bureaucrats generate growth. It's kind of, go out, build on your strengths, bring investment in, grow the economy. But then the incentive is that you get to keep some of the proceeds of that growth. And you can do that through rather kind of informal, what some might say corrupt means, or sometimes through slightly more formal means of doing that. But it is a kind of local profit sharing.
And you're exactly right. The term is profit sharing, and it's exactly like franchising. And it creates a very high-powered incentive system for performance. For example, if you bring in investment into your locality as a civil servant, you could keep up to 5%, 10% of it. That's millions and millions of dollars. But your salary as a civil servant is only maybe $100 a month. Right? So it operated basically as a profit-sharing system. That creates a lot of problems, including corruption, as you pointed out, which is now a big problem for China, and they're trying to fight corruption. But at the same time, they channel these energies of what we might think of as corruption towards performance defined narrowly as capital accumulation.
And it does bring extraordinary growth. And you have these case studies of, I think you call them Upstart County and Glorious County. And I think it's in Glorious County that they have what's called a beehive strategy, where even the Department of Sports, the Department of Women's Affairs, every bureaucratic agency in that county is tasked with bringing in investors. Go and get investors to generate growth. So there's this kind of single-minded focus on growth. And as a result, all kinds of investment comes in, but then often that kind of gets tangled up in red tape, and all kinds of members of the street-level bureaucracy are trying to shake people down and skim off rents from these enterprises. And that takes me back to your book, Kunal, and this notion between ordered and disordered deals, closed deals and open deals. And I wasn't quite sure where China fitted in to this schema.
Actually, I think, and as you talked about the Beehive campaign, I was reading that particular chapter on the Beehive campaign. I thought, wow, this is absolutely what we were talking about in our book. That's pretty amazing, really. Because that was essentially a kind of a move from a disorder to ordered deal, where you had local bureaucrats who are trying to get local investors in, mostly friends and family, and offering them chance to come invest, where the incentives were that if they do that, then there's a profit-sharing arrangement. And so it was very much an ordered deal. Now, so that was a very important part of the story of why there was a growth acceleration at that time. What the point then is that were they closed or open deals? I would feel, reading that particular chapter in the book, they were both closed and open deals. They were closed because they were offered to friends and family initially. So in that sense, they were closed. But there were so many bureaucrats offering these deals, there's so many investors, in that sense they were open. And if you contrast China with some of the other countries we've looked at in our book, that's not so clear. That in most other countries, you tend to see smaller sets of economic actors with a smaller set of political elites, where they're clearly more closed than open. I think in China we did see a mix of closed and open, and possibly more open over time, from what I could make out in our understanding of the way it worked over time.
What did you think about Kunal's framework, and did it kind of have any purchase on the Chinese situation?
I think that the idea of open and closed, as you described, is highly relevant. I mean, in the case of the Beehive campaign, it is inclusive development to the extent that the entire bureaucracy of a city, which is about 20,000 people out of 1 million people, all of these 20,000 civil servants were asked to participate in this process. But I think you are exactly right when you say that it's open and closed, because it's open completely, but only to an elite strata, right, of that particular society. And I think maybe something that's useful to bear in mind is that it's not only in China, but I think in most developing countries, you don't really have a strict divide between state and society, because you always have this intermediate group of people who are halfway between state and society. Traditionally, China has always been this way. They have a gentry class. And I wish there were European historians here who could jump in. I'm sure it's not unique to China, right? In European history, we would find, local elites who could speak directly to the prince, but who were accountable to his people. And so, yes, I think you're absolutely right that opening the deals were a big part of the kickstarting, but it was a semi-closed open. Yes.
Okay. Rachel, any reflections on this?
Well, I was just, in hearing this, thinking how, your description of setting the right incentives and then letting people have the flexibility to respond to them is actually, your standard economic prescription about how you should do things when you don't have full information, right? Get the incentives right and give people freedom to do it. It can be quite hard to do that often, but it's, I'm also struck by the link to some work that Imran Rasool has done at UCL on bureaucratic effectiveness in Nigeria, showing that giving bureaucrats more flexibility in terms of how they respond to the needs actually led, even in what we think of as an incredibly corrupt state and bureaucracy within that state, giving that flexibility actually proved to create more effective results. So just really interested in that link to kind of what would be a kind of pure economic, way of thinking about it.
Great. Now, Dirk, one of the interesting arguments in Yuan Yuan's book is that reform it's incremental, so it builds on what already exists, but it's very wide-ranging. Sort of almost every aspect of the bureaucracy is changed and are involved in this, and almost every sector of the economy also. Whereas in Set's paper, you suggest that for many countries a more targeted approach might be preferable, that these kind of wide-scale reforms are too ambitious. Do you want to talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah. I think so Jan's book is also excellent book, actually, so that's, I really like the book around sort of directed improvisation. I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it. I suppose it is important to think about giving the flexibility. And I was also struck by a paper by Hubert Smits on this, on the case of Vietnam, that were some provinces that were experimenting more than others with some of a central direction that gave good results. I do think, though, that we also need to think about a targeted approach a bit more, and also in the context of deals. So I think you go from closed to open deals. It's also important to think about what type of deals, what is the quality of these deals in terms of the transformational potential, and how do they help you to transform your economy. In that context, if you think about a set approach, so what we're looking at and have been looking at in a range of countries is first think about what's been happening in the country in terms of transformation, and very often in low-income countries very little has happened. Then you think about the sort of the factors behind this. So the second block of analysis is thinking, well, what are the economic constraints and what are the political economy constraints behind this, and then thirdly, you start thinking around. Knowing this, what are sort of the policies that we need to be thinking about to do something about transformation, and then you come into sort of both general policies, sort of the horizontal type of policies, but also the vertical policies that are really important. And also the theory would actually definitely suggest that this is really important to think about the more targeted approach. And then you come to the sort of the fourth block of analysis, which is the sort of the how to do it. And then you also start realizing that countries that have transformed have done a range of different things, and it can be sometimes too complex to do that in a single country that is still at low income country level, low income level, and therefore try and think around maybe a deal or a series of deals around a targeted set of issues may have more promise of actually working. And so that's both from an economics point of view. So targeted analysis theoretically is important, solving problems of investors, solving market and coordination failures that are specific. They're not necessarily only economy-wide. There are some market and coordination failures are more important than others to transform your economy. But it's also sort of say, well, actually, if you have a special economic zone, for example, there are lots of things that you need to think around to get done. So lots of different ministries need to be involved, lots of coordination is involved. And then to sort of say, well, let's do it around, let's coordinate our actions around the zone. And then that can have spillover effects. And of course, in the case of China, my understanding is that the zone building has had lots of spillover effects on the rest of the economy. And so starting somewhere from a zone or from a particular sector or a particular area, and then building that out has both economic merits, but also, my feeling, also political economy merits as well. And so we're often looking into what is it actually that you can do next, and that, of course, there's a general economic frameworks are important. The making markets work can still be important, but it's got to be more than that. It's definitely investment climate plus. So it's got to be really more than that. And so it may not be an either or, but it's definitely just getting the investment climate all right is definitely not enough. I think we will all agree on that.
I suppose one of the sort of interesting differences between China and the kind of countries that ODI sometimes works is that you say that for China, although it's a very decentralized governmental system, nevertheless, when the top leadership decides on something and sends a signal, it creates seismic changes across the country. Whereas in many of the countries that ODI works in, the top leadership can send signals, but nothing really happens, okay? So the idea that you can have this kind of big push across all sectors is maybe a little bit unrealistic. And also, in many of the countries that ODI works, it's not clear that the top leadership is committed to growth anyway. So I think that one of the rationales for the set approach is that you can go in with a demonstration project, and just by showing that growth is possible, you can then begin to shift perceptions, and that maybe this will have positive spillover effects. Yeah. Okay. I want to turn to you now, Rachel, because we've been talking quite a bit about China, and of course we all know that China is not a democracy, and therefore that the sort of space for voice and accountability is limited. But you've been doing quite a lot of work which looks at the role of voice and accountability in places like Sierra Leone in kind of improving governance and the economy. And so I wonder if you can give us a different perspective now on how to stimulate growth.
Yeah, and as I say, my perspective is when I work on a country, I try and get stuck in to understand it, and then and see how we can improve things from where we are. So, I came into Sierra Leone in 2004, the end of the Civil War, and it was a democracy, and so it was more a question of how do we improve things from where we are. Obviously a very different history from China. I wouldn't say what we're doing necessarily has immediate transfer to China. I think so I'm also a little bit cautious about saying about, do this and you're going to get growth. I think actually economists need to be a little bit more cautious or about, saying, well, you can do these things and you suddenly get growth. I think what we can say more about is you can do things and those will improve people's lives. So part of the reason I work on accountability is just because it can help improve people's lives. I don't know whether it's going to lead to, improved growth, but
Because you think it has intrinsic value.
well, there's intrinsic value, and it can also improve. There's a difference between improving incomes and improving growth, right? And actually, most of what economists have things to say about is improving people's income or improving people's outcomes. Improved education, which we may value for its own sake. We're actually not quite as good at saying what leads to persistent long-run growth, right? That's just a bigger question. And most of our theories are actually about how to improve income, not growth, because those are two different things. Sorry, I just want to be clear that the limits of what I feel I can talk about. So I think, yes, accountability is important for its own sake, but it's also important for getting people the services they need, which they don't have in Sierra Leone. It's worst outcome, really close to the bottom in World Development Indicators on pretty much everything. So how do we get those services to work? And for that, I think we do think that accountability is really important, because the government is just not delivering the basic services that people need. And as I say, looking at democracy really came from looking at a bunch of other approaches which don't seem to be very effective. And they're saying, look, this is a democracy. A lot of Africa has moved to democracy, and yet it's not delivering what we were hoping it was delivering. You've still got corruption. You've still got the services are not responding to the needs of people. So how do we improve that link? Well, maybe let's give democracy another go, because it's not working very well, because people in Sierra Leone, there's little accountability, because you have this problem that you see in many countries where people's votes is very tied to their ethnicity. So in the north, you've got predominantly Temne population, and they all vote APC, and in the south, you've got a Mende population that mainly votes SLPP. So there's no real contestability in the elections. So kind of obviously it's not going to lead to accountability. So what can you do about that? Well, we found that in local elections, there is more. People are willing to cross ethnic lines. And they have much more information about their candidates at the local level. So we said, well, is it an information problem? So can you then provide people with information about the candidates, and will they respond? Or is it just, no, I'm always going to vote, North, I'm always going to vote APC, South, I'm always going to vote SLPP? Or is it just that people are voting that way because, why not? If you have no information, you might as well vote for your local ethnic party. And surprisingly, we found if you provided, if you set up debates between candidates so that people could observe the different candidates, they would change how they voted, suggesting that it wasn't some deeply entrenched ethnic bias, but it was just, what else? I might as well, because I don't know anything else about the candidates. And so people were willing to change their vote. And then, as a response, the politicians actually became more accountable. How did we measure that? They went back to their constituencies more, and when we tracked how they spent their money, they spent it more effectively. I'm not saying that's suddenly going to transform into 6% growth. That's where I started, right? But it's the first step in putting in place accountability, which we think is an important thing, both on its own rights and just to improve services. There were better roads built as a result of this, and if we can do that, I'm kind of happy with that.
So if China's story is one of sort of harnessing the institutions of a post-Maoist bureaucracy to growth, then yours is a story of harnessing the institutions of a post-conflict democracy for better development. So how do you work with those institutions that exist? Okay. Kunal, Yuan, any thoughts on this case, this different approach?
I think, first of all, I think it's very important to keep in mind that there are other mechanisms by which growth can happen, and one of them is very important here is public goods delivery, education, health, and so on. So one should not, though in our book we look at particular relationship between political elites and economic actors, which are deals. Obviously, there are the mechanisms which we haven't discussed in our book, which are also important. So that's one point. The second point is that I think, though where we might differ slightly on think about accountability would be as follows, that while there's no question that more accountable institutions or more inclusive institutions are good for their own sake, but also for progressive political development, it's also true to say that at least as far as economic growth is concerned, it might be quite, one has to be careful in trying to move to inclusive institutions fairly quickly. I mean, what we do tend to seem to see is growth accelerations happen under what we call dominant party settlements, which are not inclusive by any stretch of the imagination. And so pushing for inclusion at that stage might not necessarily be something that might be counterproductive as far as economic growth is concerned. So that's one point, that one has to be careful about the question of inclusion as far as the question around democratization and growth is concerned.
Because very few of the growth accelerations in your study actually took place under competitive regimes,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely,
But then, is it the case that then opening up the regime politically can sometimes help sustain growth, or not?
I think that, again, the argument we have made is that moving to more inclusive institutions or more open deals, as we call it, because we're careful not to use the word institutions here, they can be different to different people, is important, yes. But having said that, moving to open deals very quickly, and I think, again, Union talks about in your book, prematurely is also not very, can be counterproductive, as the Rwanda case study in our book shows, where there's been an argument made by the chapter authors that a premature movement into open deals in certain sectors has not been conducive to growth maintenance. So again, it's a question of the balance between order and inclusion. Just getting it right. I mean, it's not essential either or, but keeping the balance right is very important.
I mean, getting the balance and getting the timing as well is very
Can I
Richard.
possibly just come back on part of that? Because I think what we're talking about, if you're saying impose from outside, demanding that somebody move to democracy and suddenly have a change in power, that's very different from what I'm talking about, which is within a context in which there had already been changes of power, but you have this tension of the power brokers being associated with different ethnic groups, which we think from history is kind of a particularly vulnerable position to be in. If you can help people see things not so much as an ethnic split, but be voting on policy as opposed to, then, given the history around the war in Sierra Leone was not ethnic, I should, be really clear to say, but, I worry about, saying we should have a dominant, party in Sierra Leone where it's really 50-50 and, and the parties are dominated by one ethnicity or another. That sounds like not a place anyone wants to go. What I'm talking about is providing information to kind of break down the salience of the ethnicities. I'd argue that's probably going in the right direction.
I mean, one of the interesting findings of your study, Rachel, is that these public debates increased the responsiveness of the candidates or the winning candidates. And one of the ways they did that was by spending some more money on development from their constituency development funds. But it also led to increased gift giving in those elections. And so then that's a kind of form of corruption which often we look at unfavorably. So it suggests that there's not a kind of an automatic correlation between even increasing information and debate and getting better quality public policy right. So it's kind of a tortuous road from increased information to better governance.
I mean, welcome to the messy world
Yeah,
of development.
yeah.
I mean, is anyone surprised that not everything goes exactly as, in the very simplistic line? I think that's just, yes, that is how, the way we see it is, this led to an increase in contestability of these constituencies. We think, there's something not great about most of the country not being contestable. Now, when you increase some contestability in these environments, you will have, they'll contest on all sorts of different fronts, right? So, and I'm not saying that this is leading to a perfect world.
That's a shame. I thought you had all the answers.